Okay, good evening. Welcome to the Rhine Nature Center. I was very happy to see such a strong turnout for tonight. Some people may trickle in as the presentation is going on, and we can laugh and point at them. My name is Christine Siller. I'm the Executive Director of the Nature Center. I'm very excited to welcome tonight Kevin Dahms. Kevin is a water resources engineer at Biohabitats. Kevin, how did you become a water resources engineer?
I went to school for engineering, and it was a very broad engineering, but I was super interested in designing with nature and trying to, actually like do a lot of conservation and restoration work, and discovered green infrastructure, which I'll talk quite a bit about tonight, and then worked at New York City DEP on their green infrastructure program. So that was what led me to it. And then I brought into my education and experience into like ecological restoration, resilience, and more like, ecological science than rather than just like civil engineering.
Great. So what he's trying to say is he was moved by his passion for doing right for natural habitats to pursue his career in water resources, because that's what he wrote originally here in his bio. Kevin was found by our own conservation director, Laura Green. Laura has been a part of the Nature Center since 2019, when she worked on a second iteration of our habitat management plan. Laura comes from the Yale School of Forestry Management. She's a licensed forester in Connecticut and is currently working on this site to do a lot of ecological restoration projects. So tonight, we are going to get the benefit of hearing both of them talk about their ideas on how we can work on our own properties to deal with stormwater, as well as hint at probably some of the bigger, larger scale projects that would have to occur to help our own properties.
Cool. Thanks, Christine. Yeah, I would much prefer this to be engaging and interactive. So if you guys do have questions as I'm going through the material, please interrupt me, raise your hand, talk about it, and then very much looking forward to the Q&A at the end. So thank you, Christine, for that introduction. All right. So I'm going to be going through how water moves through our watersheds, and what we do on the land and how that impacts water and basically the health of our ecosystems. And so the first step in that is basic watershed science, a quick introduction to what watersheds are, how they're influenced by our activities and our decisions, and then what our activities and decisions do to impact the water quality and ecosystems within our watersheds. So what are the impacts and challenges associated with humans living within watersheds? And then going to spend most of the time talking about solutions in terms of mitigating and dealing with those challenges. Going to touch briefly on the more traditional gray infrastructure that we see all over, but more focus on nature-based solutions and nature-based infrastructure and how we can use natural systems to our benefit in terms of treating our water or infiltrating the water and preventing flooding. And then I do have a couple of case studies from my work in New York City, as well as my work with Biohabitats, the project we have in northern New Jersey, and a few other ones that we can talk about just to see how these solutions work in practice. So before reading the definition on here, how many folks in the audience know what a watershed is? Okay, cool. So everyone kind of knows what a watershed is. So a watershed can really be anything where water falls. It's essentially the delineation of an area where any drop of water that falls on that area goes to a single point. And so, all of our land is part of a watershed, but watersheds can also be as small as a rooftop. So your rooftop can be a watershed draining to the gutter on your house. Could also obviously be like the Mississippi Basin, which is like almost half the country. So it really depends on where you're defining your outlet point for what a watershed is, and thinking about how you're going to manage the land in that watershed. So really thinking about scale for all these projects is really important because that's going to depend on how much water you're dealing with and the types of problems that you're dealing with within the watershed. And so there's a lot of very awesome tools out there to help you easily delineate your watershed. So this is the watershed leading to Blind Brook right outside of the nature center here. It's about 11 square miles. I think Laura's going to talk a little bit more specifically about the Blind Brook watershed, and then ultimately discharges to Long Island Sound. And so this is through, this is through the USGS Stream Stats website. So if you just Google USGS Stream Stats, you kind of come up on a map, and then all the water bodies are basically mapped on there, and you click a point and it'll map it for you. It'll give you information about runoff, flows, peak flows, different like size storms, and what you'll see in your watershed. It's pretty preliminary. So we use it for kind of like high level analysis. Like what's the rough size of the watershed, or like what might the 2-year storm event look like? Just to get a sense. We do more thorough modeling and analysis when we're actually like designing a project on a site. But it's a great tool for folks to use to just go on and click and see like, where is the water that's adjacent to my property coming from? And so what, as we're thinking about how water is moving through watersheds and thinking about flooding, water quality, what might impact how water is flowing in the watershed? Anyone have any thoughts? Sure.
Physical structures.
Sure, like what?
Buildings, parking lots.
Yep, exactly. Get your hand.
Yeah, water absorption into the ground or blockage on that, on the water body.
Mm-hmm.
Mountain trees.
Yep, awesome.
Yeah.
Yep, yeah, so groundwater and how exactly, awesome. And so those are all spot on. One thing, it's like our land use, agriculture. When we convert what was maybe forested land into agriculture, you're changing the surface of the ground. You're also changing what's going on to the surface of the ground. You're putting a whole bunch of fertilizer and nutrients on there, and then growing crops. So there's a certain amount of water use on the site there. You're taking water and maybe irrigating the land. It's not just the water that's falling on the land. Within the channel of a river, you might see dams. So that's going to obviously impact how water is flowing down your streams and your tributaries and ultimately through the watershed. Deforestation. So like we said, trees are a huge impact or a huge indicator of the health of a watershed. So deforestation, like you'll see, and I'll talk about in a second, leads to more runoff and erosion and a flashier system. But really, I think the biggest influence, especially in areas like Westchester County and the Northeast here, is development. Development's probably the biggest influence we see on watersheds and watershed health. When you start to remove trees, even agricultural land or meadows, and you start to see more parking lots and buildings, that has a really dramatic impact on how water flows through the system and the quality of your water bodies, your receiving water bodies throughout the watershed. And so when you change an island like Mannahatta into Manhattan and it's completely covered in asphalt buildings and concrete, it's a very different system when water's falling on it than when it was, when the Native Americans lived here. And then so as a water resource engineer and thinking about resilience and flooding, especially in urban systems, the main thing we look at, or one of the primary things we look at, is impervious cover. Have folks heard impervious cover before? Seeing a lot of nods. If you're used to flooding, then I'm sure you've heard about it quite a bit. Yeah, so in like a forested landscape, the water, lands on the surface, infiltrates into the ground. Before it even lands on the surface, trees and plants are intercepting that precipitation. And you're getting a lot of it infiltrating into the ground and moving slowly through the subsurface as groundwater and slowly making its way to a stream or a river or a lake. When you start to put roads and buildings onto a landscape, there's nowhere for that water to go. It doesn't infiltrate into the ground. It's usually pipes, whether it's through gutters or actually subsurface pipes, to quickly get that water away from human property as quickly as possible. And that has a huge influence on how water's moving throughout the entire watershed.
Can I ask a little bit more about piping and
Yeah.
general? Like, so if we take, you know, what's occurring naturally to the watershed, and some would argue that solutions for flooding issues or water problems is actually piping things
Mhm.
in different directions. Can you just give like your insights on how that may affect like watershed and natural flow of water?
Yeah.
And
So
I just don't know what that really entails or why people argue for that.
yeah, I'll touch on that in a little once I
Okay,
get to solutions. But I think but to I guess to quickly answer that is yes, what that would be doing is addressing the easiest way to address flooding on your property is to pipe it away. And so traditionally humans have tried to get the water away from their property as quickly as possible. But what that does is it just brings the problem downstream, right? So if you have like 4 upstream properties diverting their water as quickly as possible downstream, the properties downstream are going to be getting all that water much faster than they would if you were holding it on your property, you know, in a strategic way. And so trying to, which we'll get into a little bit, is like, how do we mimic the natural systems and try and restore some of the natural hydrology of the watershed pre-development?
I'm just thinking about what happened in Houston, what was it, about a year or two ago?
Mhm. Yep.
And my understanding is that it's also the type of soil on which you're building. So if you're building on swampland, potentially that's not even a good base for the unit. And they had, and again, and covered with all this concrete, you can have so many manholes or gutters or pipes, but there's just too much water, because then you talk about water coming from the sky, the rain. There's more of those events.
Yep.
And there's just, you can't pump it fast enough.
Right. And in those areas, it's beyond even just necessarily water going through the watershed, and more if you're in if you're in a more area that's more wetlands, and so it's the groundwater is just so high, there's nowhere for the water to even infiltrate, and you're just dealing with the water because you're at the low point generally, and so you need to pump. And so I think also something to keep in mind, especially as I'm going through some of like the nature-based solutions, is that it's not a silver bullet, and it needs to be combined with more hard infrastructure. And it's very site specific to whatever your challenge is, and what might be appropriate versus not. So I think those are good questions of what might work in Westchester County might not be appropriate for a very low-lying area in Texas, or like in Louisiana, where like they're subsiding as well. They're basically almost below sea level. There's nowhere for the water to go, because so much of this depends on gravity, right? That's what really dictates where the water goes. And so this graph, I'm going to show a couple of graphs, but they're not very specific to anything. It's really just to demonstrate what I'm getting at when I'm talking about the influence of impervious area on a watershed and flow in the watershed. So this is a hydrograph, which is showing flow versus time during a storm event. And so in a more forested landscape where we have the water infiltrating into the ground, it's moving slowly through the subsurface to the stream. You get this really slow, gradual rise up of a peak flow during a storm event, and then a slow down, and you have this nice base flow. And so you don't get, much of a dramatic increase in the flow of this receiving body of water in the stream.
Could you say sort of what's base flow, peak flow, what is this?
Yeah, so the peak flow is basically what you're seeing around hour 5 there. So that's after rain event. The rain event probably occurred around 2, depending on how large your watershed is. And so the peak flow is what you're seeing, that hump there. That's like the increase in flow associated with the rain event. And then base flow is what's really what you're seeing at the end of that curve around 12 hours 12 and 16. So that's what's flowing in the stream just normally. And so in a forested system, you have the slow feed of water from the groundwater, and all that water is kind of going into that stream. In a more urban system, that water is just being, again, piped as quickly as possible down that stream and out of the system to get it away from people and to prevent flooding. So this graph is showing, again, a forested watershed versus a more urban watershed during a presumed the same size rain event. And you can see it creates this, what we call a flashy system. It's a really quick spike up, and then again, really quick down. The water is in and out of that stream as quickly as possible. And in a natural system, it's more balanced. the water's staying in there longer, and you're not getting those super high flows. And so when we think about, oh yeah, go ahead.
Just ask a question. Woman brought up something about Texas and our Henri Ida
Mhm.
scenario. The other thing was even the soil were so saturated that they had exceeded that, so you couldn't stay. So there must be like this inflection point where it's
Yes.
too much, no matter what the rate.
There is, and I think when we think about really extreme events like that, there's only so much you can do. Like those events are going to cause flooding, and it's because our soils only have so much capacity to infiltrate, right, the water, and especially if there's precedent rain events, they're going to be saturated, and so they have less capacity at that point. And these more extreme and larger events are they're more expensive to design for, quite bluntly. And it's like, are you going to design for this 500-year event, a very large event? It's going to cost this much more money. Or are there more strategic ways that we can, look at where are buildings and certain properties located? Where are we developing? What kind of land use do we have on certain properties and in certain areas adjacent to water bodies, which we can talk about a little bit. I think that's a good conversation point for as we're kind of talking through some of the problems that you guys are seeing, and what the interest levels are. So when we think about flooding, and this gets a little bit to that, thinking about this, having this hydrograph in mind. Again, this is flow rate over time for a storm. This is not the same system or the same graph, it's just representative, but it's another hydrograph, again, showing time and then essentially water elevation associated with flow on the vertical axis. And this gives you an idea of how a developed versus an undeveloped watershed might behave. Because like we saw in an undeveloped watershed, your peak is much lower than your urban watershed, right? And so on the right there, it's tough to see with the light, but that's basically the area of flooding, the area of inundation. And so when you have that lower stage, your area is obviously much smaller. In an urban watershed where you get that super, dramatic peak, your area of flooding is much larger. It's pretty obvious, but like that's kind of where you see, you can see the difference in the area of inundation there. Is that clear how like this hydrograph kind of relates to the images on the right there, the area of that flooding? And while this isn't necessarily showing, this graph is, I want to be clear, is not showing undeveloped versus developed. It tries to demonstrate that point. Cool. So that's the brief hydrology watershed basics. Is that kind of clear to everyone? There may be questions on that, how that works. Then moving into how does the urbanization of a watershed, what does it do to our ecosystems and to our water bodies? And what are some of the issues that we've seen? I'm sure you guys have probably seen this throughout your neighborhoods, or throughout your community, is erosion, especially during these large events. And so when you get that flashier system, you have higher flows, higher velocities, more scour in your streams, and that results in this dramatic erosion in channels and at outfalls. And then that's exacerbated even further when you start to remove riparian vegetation like trees and shrubs, because those roots are holding that soil in place. And once you remove those, it just starts to eat away and erode. And so that causes all kinds of problems, especially if you have structures or anything adjacent to these banks, but also just creating, all this erosion that the sediment is moving downstream. And then very briefly, I did want to talk about combined sewer overflows, just because one of the case studies that we look at is concerned with combined sewer overflows. And I know it's common in the Northeast. Have folks heard of combined sewer overflows before? Okay, cool. Getting nods. Not always the case. So it's pretty gross in a lot of older cities. The storm drainage, so the pipes that collect all the rainwater are the same pipes that are carrying the sewage from your house to the wastewater treatment plants. And so they're only sized to a certain size carrying capacity, essentially, a certain flow rate. And so during some large storm events, that capacity is exceeded, and that all the material that's in that pipe is discharged out to a water body because the treatment plants can't handle it. And so that's in a combined sewer, and which is up top there, right? So during dry weather, it's fine. The sewage is going into the pipe, being carried to the wastewater treatment plant, and it's being treated. But when that capacity is exceeded, that mix of rainwater, stormwater, and sewage is discharged into Long Island Sound or adjacent, river. And so this happens a lot in older cities just because that's how the infrastructure was built. And I think in most of the communities, if not all, in Westchester County, it's all separate sewers. So your sewage, and your stormwater are separate, and so it's not as much of a concern. But I did want to just talk about this because it's a big issue in New York and in New York City, and that's one of the case studies that we're going to look at.
So I don't know if you're familiar with the safe sound, but the city of Rye has a chronic problem, the illegal sewer hookup.
Mm-hmm.
So people's sanitary lines from their houses are connected to our storm sewer. So even in dry weather, we can detect fecal bacteria in the brook.
Mm.
So, and that is the cause. And then the other cause is that our storm sewers are all like crumbling.
Yep, I was going to say that's another big one, right? Is that you have the whole or a damaged infrastructure, and so when it rains, it's all leaking out. And I know that's one of like the first steps in, right now MS4 municipal separate sewer system is a big program that's going on throughout the country, and so separate sewer systems or sewer communities are going through a whole planning process to assess what's causing water quality impacts in the watershed. And so one of the first things they do is they look at illegal connections or that damaged infrastructure that's causing those leaks. No, but I think I am familiar with that to save the sound.
Is there a way for private residents to know whether or not they have like an illegal hookup that they're not aware of?
Yeah, you can probably hire an engineer to come and do it. It's like some kind of a smoke test where they put some test on this paper, and then they can detect this.
So the impacts of erosion, the impacts of impervious area, combined sewer overflows, basically changing how the water is running off the land and what it's running off over. It's roads, it's agricultural lands, has a lot of water quality impacts too. And so I know, especially given all the big storms over the past summer, like water quantity, like volumes and flows is a big concern, but a lot of times in the work that I do, water quality is really the driving force, especially of some of these nature-based solutions, because even like small rain events, like a 1-inch rain event, can have really negative implications associated with water quality, because you have fertilizers running off into water bodies. You have, even with that erosion, you have all that sediment going off. And so it causes turbidity. It negatively impacts aquatic vegetation. With all the nutrient runoff, you get a lot of algal blooms, which obviously can shut down water bodies in terms of recreation. And then you get fish kills, really poor for aquatic life. And so a lot of the work that I do is really driven by improving water quality in the receiving water bodies so that it's suitable for aquatic life and for recreation for humans. And again, so like the key things that we're looking at are nutrients and sediment are really the in a lot of the water bodies that I work in are the primary drivers that we're looking to control. So when we're thinking about like kind of the traditional solutions, like I said before, generally the idea was to get the water out away from us as quickly as possible. And so we did that through pipes. In some instances, we just lined a channel with concrete and totally straightened it, taking away any ecological value, any natural flow pattern of that stream, just get it downstream as quickly as possible. When we're dealing with erosion, it's pretty common to see this giant riprap bank here, just because that size stone isn't going to move, but really what it's doing, it's going to push all the energy downstream, just like you're pushing the water downstream when you concrete line the channels. And again, in some instances, this might be the only solution just because you don't have enough space. But more recently, engineers and ecologists have kind of gotten together and we've been thinking about like more nature-based solutions. And so I will get into what those solutions might look like, but this is generally what you have seen in the past that engineers have prioritized. And then on the water quality side of things, we do have wastewater treatment plants. For combined sewer overflows, they have like large tanks that just hold the stormwater and slowly release it into the sewer system so that it doesn't overflow. Again, these are really large, what's called gray infrastructure. So big tanks, big pipes. They're effective. They tend to be very expensive. They're also not very adaptable. So you build a tank or a wall or a pipe to a certain size, and it's going to only convey what that design flow is. And they don't really have many co-benefits. They're not providing any habitat value. People aren't recreating with them. So just some of the considerations that, at least like firms like Biohabitats, we're really excited about the nature-based solutions because they offer some of those co-benefits. But again, want to be clear that oftentimes it's a combination of gray and green that needs to be done to meet goals, especially when we're thinking about really large storms like the ones we've seen. In terms of the nature-based solutions, I'm going to go through a couple of general strategies and design approaches that we take. I've tried to group those strategies into 3 levels of essentially like levels of design. So there's conservation, restoration, and regenerative design, going from like most intensive or least intensive design to most intensive design. I think, and they all relate to these natural systems that we're familiar with: wetlands, forests, riparian buffers, whether it's trying to preserve those ecosystems or trying to mimic them or restore them, or really just trying to take the function that they provide in the landscape and mimic that through an engineered design in a more urban system. So I like to start with conservation because I think it can be the easiest in some instances. If you have a healthy ecosystem like a wetland or a riparian buffer that already exists in your watershed, try and do everything you can to preserve it. And so there are state regulations, obviously, around wetlands and everything. Those things exist, but I think it's easy to say, oh, I'm going to just develop this wetland, but we'll mitigate it elsewhere. And so I think, I do think that conservation where it's possible is really important. And I know I'm like preaching to the choir here. You guys are at the Rye Nature Center, but I just think it's really important to note that, because so many times, especially engineers, we just come up with an engineered solution to something. And oftentimes, if there's something that exists, it can be more valuable than whatever we design. And when you're thinking about conservation, a large bit of planning and assessment needs to go into that. So you need to know like what resources you have within your watershed or on your property. Is this wetland high value? What kind of value is it providing? And so that there is some planning that might need to go into that. But a lot of communities, I know Westchester County is going through this right now with a couple of watersheds, through watershed planning activities and watershed management plans. These types of resources are identified, and you can kind of move forward then knowing that we have these resources in this area of the watershed that need to be preserved. And also might be a good slide to touch on the fact or the idea of sort of like non-structural solutions. So thinking about like policy and zoning and what's allowed to be done in certain areas like floodplains, where you might want to prioritize things like parks or more natural areas in those areas that are flooded. I think recognizing that places like Rye and New York City and generally the Northeast are pretty developed already. A lot of those decisions have been made, but where they haven't, or where redevelopment is being considered, thinking about uses that allow an area to be flooded, is obviously the smart thing to do. Oh yeah.
A quick question regarding watershed management policies. Is that done at the local city town level, or is it, because there's so many little villages and towns, so it is at that micro level, or is it more at the county level?
So it's done, it depends on the state, and generally it's challenging because policies that influence watershed health are made at all the levels, right? So you might have local zoning decisions that are made that impact watershed health, but then you might have larger planning efforts that are being done by the county that might implement a broad countywide regulation. And then there's the state regulations that influence what you can do on wetlands or in certain water bodies. So it's kind of all tiers, because there's not really like the state's probably the most overarching, I would say, where their policies guide most of it, but there are local decisions and county level decisions that are made that influence watershed health. Does that answer your? It is, and so
making decisions that are not holistic.
Yeah, and I think, and so when we do watershed management plans, we try to bring in all those municipalities and the local governments to get on board with the planning decisions that are being made in that context. And so it is very challenging because there's all these different moving pieces and different priorities. And obviously watersheds don't abide by, municipal or state lines. So that can be pretty challenging.
I can speak specifically to Rye for you. I sat on the Conservation Commission for 4 years, many, many, many hours at City Hall in planning commission meetings. I've learned exactly how this works. One thing I do want to say about trees is that there's no, and this is not enshrined in code, this is just practice, that if you take down a tree in the planning commission, meeting, we'll say, oh, well, we'll put up another tree, or we'll put up 5 little saplings, right? There is no notion of the value of a mature tree in the watershed in that way. It's not quantified.
Mm-hmm.
And so we will see, I'm sure you all have seen, that they just cut them down and they have to preserve something for like 3 years, and then who knows, but it's not the same. So the decisions in Rye are happening in those rooms, it's public, but they're of incredible importance. And I just think that we need to connect those dots a little bit more, because right now it's within the 4 corners of the law, but laws can be changed.
Right, and that's just within Rye, right? And so there's certainly towns that are upstream of you, or that maybe aren't having that same conversation, or their planning, their environmental condition is different. So it is challenging. I think it is getting everyone on board and talking and recognizing that we're all part of the same watershed. So I think it's an important way to think about things. It obviously is not always, politics doesn't always play out like that, but yeah, no, it's a good question. It is challenging. I don't envy people on the political side of things related to that. Or residents. I'm a resident I'm also in a watershed in New York City. This slide was just to demonstrate that conservation, like just doing conservation of wetlands, can have a large impact, especially related to flooding. So this study was done after Irene in Vermont, and it found that, and I think it ended up, they said that it's probably more than 1.8 million that was avoided associated with flooding in Irene. They basically looked at 2 communities in Vermont, one that had X acres of wetland in their watershed and another one that didn't, and the difference in the damage associated with those towns. It's Middlebury, I forget the other one. But yeah, I mean, it's pretty dramatic. And we recently completed a study for an area in upstate New York, and we were looking and we found that wetlands on average can be valued at like $500 to $1,000 per acre in terms of their flood mitigation potential. It really depends on where you're at, because when you think about flooding and vulnerability, it's how much flooding, but also like what are those assets that are going to be flooded? How valuable are they? So it's hard to I don't like putting a monetary value on it, but it is helpful for a lot of people to see that. And so obviously in a lot of the areas where we live, especially in the Northeast here, you don't necessarily have a lot of intact forests or wetlands to conserve. And so you might need to be a little bit more proactive. And so oftentimes we'll be asked to do restoration projects. And in these projects, it's often agricultural lands or maybe old vacant lots where we're trying to restore the ecosystem that was there previously. And again, trying to restore the ecosystem services of flood mitigation, water quality improvement, habitat that those ecosystems provided. So this is a project, not one of the case studies I'm going to go into, but just to kind of show, this is one of the projects, a project we did in Ohio, where we restored this massive old agricultural field to a more functioning floodplain. So we graded it to create kind of more like pond wetland systems. It's holding water. It's providing more microtopography for habitat value, planting trees, and more native floodplain species. And again, just trying, and I think the primary function of this one was water quality improvement. So providing filtering of nutrients in this old agricultural field. And so it's a large restoration project. That was in Ohio. I would have to look up, I can let you know where in Ohio, but it was in our Great Lakes bioregion. Yeah, it was recently completed. And then even in areas that are maybe more developed or like have been manipulated by humans more, you can still do restoration. So the bottom left here is an old golf course where we did a large restoration here. And so this is, again, restoring some wetland system to this golf course where we created these microtopography, planted native vegetation, and trying to divert the flows through this landscape in a more natural way to restore that natural hydrology. And the top right photo was an old eroded gully that we created, again, a more like vernal pool wetland system, again, trying to restore what a natural ecosystem would look like in that context. And restoration doesn't always have to involve like heavy grading and realignment. We often do a lot of native planting for restoration work. So these are two riparian buffer planting projects that we've done. One, the bottom left, is in Connecticut. I'm actually not sure what the top right one is, but looking at planting native tree species along a river. And so you're restoring habitat there, you're providing some of that stabilization to the soil so it's not eroding. You know, it's breaking up the soil, it's promoting infiltration. And I know when speaking with Laura that you guys are doing some of this activity here. I know New York State has a really good, it's called Trees for Tribs grant program that they give money to communities to plant along tributaries, plant trees along tributaries. And so this is a pretty straightforward, and again, doesn't require like heavy machinery and equipment to do, but we're restoring some of that ecological function to the landscape. And then moving on to what Biohabitats, or what I'm calling regenerative design. These are interventions that are a little bit more heavily engineered. And the idea is to really mimic natural systems rather than completely recreate them. And so mimic them in the sense of their function on the landscape and what they're providing to the watershed or to the contributing drainage area to a water body. They can look very natural for sure, but they're just generally in more constrained areas. And so here we might be looking at what we call regenerative stormwater conveyance. So that's what the top two photos are. I'll get into a little bit more detail in one of the case studies. Or living shorelines. Again, you have these hardened shorelines in most of our urban areas, trying to soften those with natural features like wood, stone, and vegetation. So they can certainly look very natural, but they're in generally smaller areas and trying to provide, they're designed to optimize ecological, ecosystem services and function. And then getting even more constrained or into more urban environments are bioretention systems, or like rain gardens, which maybe folks are pretty familiar with. Often see them in parking lots along roadways. These are systems that are very easy to be installed on private residences, so managing runoff from your roof or your driveway. And they can also be really large. So these are effective in the sense that they can be retrofitted into parking lots or places where impervious areas are already dominating the community. And they can try and restore some of the natural hydrology by infiltrating the water or having plants take it up. I'm going to quickly go through the next two, but happy to talk more about them if people have questions. Even more urban is green roofs. They've definitely gained popularity recently. Probably don't provide as much water volume benefits as some of the other interventions and strategies that we've talked about. But they do have co-benefits of pollinators. They can also be really nice aesthetic features. If you have rooftops, having people go up and picnic on a rooftop, or this is Brooklyn Grange in Brooklyn. It's a huge farm and they actually sell produce from it. I'm a huge fan of green roofs. They're a little bit more challenging you need structural engineering involved and everything, rather than a rain garden, which is just can be as simple as digging a pit and good infiltrating soil in your yard. Happy to talk more about rain gardens too, if anyone's interested in like installing one. It's fairly straightforward, just some slight engineering that you would need, and there's good guidance online from UConn that gives that. Thinking about more, I say that this is regenerative design kind of, because this is looking at porous pavements and it's not really providing much ecosystem or habitat value per se. It's really trying to reduce the amount of imperviousness that your traditionally impervious surfaces are providing. So the water can actually like move through your impervious surface. It's not totally impervious. It's good when you have a function of like actually needing a hard surface there, whether it's a walkway or a parking lot, but the water can infiltrate through it. It's not going to really help you in like super large storm events, because these are going to become, the capacity of these is going to become overwhelmed much more quickly than your soil generally. And they do require quite a bit of So those are like the solutions I wanted to really touch on. I would love to dive into any that people are particularly interested in. Also, realizing how we were doing on time. I do have like 2 case studies, one in New York City and then one in Bergen County, New Jersey, that might be good prompts to get people thinking about how these are applied. If that sounds good. If anyone has any questions on any of those solutions, like around just general conservation planning to restoration projects to some of these more engineered regenerative systems.
So after the storm, I started looking at stuff.
Uh-huh.
Infiltration trenches? Is
Yeah.
that the same, or is it just too much engineering?
Are you saying is that the same? You're saying is that the same as a bioswale, or is it the same like effect?
It looks like sort of like a bioswale. I mean,
Yeah, it can be similar. I don't know. I mean, this is like my world, like my profession, and I don't think anyone has like a real clear. Everyone defines things differently. Yeah, everyone defines things differently. New York State DEC does distinguish, I think, between bioretention and infiltration basins or swales. It's going to depend on what vegetation's in there and probably what their design layout is. So like the swales are generally thought to be more conveyance. So you can think of it as like a vegetated surface conveyance system. Yeah, and then an infiltration basin is designed to infiltrate, but it doesn't necessarily have to. Right, and it also doesn't need to have vegetation in it. So like a bioretention system is going to have vegetation in it. Like bioretention is the same thing as rain gardens. I would say like the DEC's stormwater manual is probably what I would use in terms of thinking about definitions. But the idea is that, but it's the same idea. Like if you were to say I'm installing an infiltration basin or a rain garden, it would be providing a lot of the same services. Yeah, probably just want to plant it with native vegetation because then you have pollinator benefits and things like that. All right, cool. So just to kind of go through how some of these solutions are implemented in the real world, I thought we could talk about what New York City is doing in terms of green infrastructure. Are folks familiar at all with New York City's green infrastructure program? It's pretty robust and one of the older ones in the country. Raise a show of hands. Anyone familiar with it? Okay, cool. Well, it's pretty exciting. They started in 2010, looking at green infrastructure, and it's largely driven by CSOs. So all of the green areas on that map are all areas that have combined sewers in New York City. So they have a huge issue of those combined sewer overflows. And it's like storms like just an inch or more will cause combined sewer overflows. Like my neighborhood's in a combined sewer in Gowanus Canal, you like go down there and you smell it. Like it's pretty gross. And so their green infrastructure program is being driven by combined sewer overflows and being required by the state through their long-term control plan. And so, like I said, they've been going at it for a pretty long time, since like 2010. And it's New York City DEP that is administering it. And it's pretty impressive what they're doing. So they're attacking it from multiple angles, looking at largely targeting public property because that's what the city owns and that's kind of what they have control over. And that's where they're able to really go in and implement projects without getting approval from private landowners, things like that. So they have right-of-way green infrastructure, so that's going in sidewalks, within roadways, public property retrofits on like parkland, on schools. They do have some public-private partnerships, and then they have a grant program where they'll actually pay for all the design and construction of green infrastructure. So they're making, so the idea of this program is to, let me see here. The idea is to prevent, essentially they're trying to manage a certain size storm, a pretty small storm, and infiltrate or hold that water before it gets to the storm sewer, the combined sewer system. The idea is to have a bunch of these decentralized assets capturing water within a small watershed. Think of like a watershed as like even just a block or like a neighborhood in the city, and trying to have a bunch of these small practices, they call them practices or assets, holding water so that it doesn't reach the combined sewer system. So you're reducing the amount of flow and volume getting into that combined sewer system, which then reduces the number of combined sewer overflows you have, or the frequency of those combined sewer overflows. Does that make sense? Correct. It's not addressing the combined, it's preventing the water from getting into the combined sewer, or reducing the amount of water that gets to the combined sewer, and reducing the frequency of those overflows. That's the objective. And again, very decentralized. It's because the city is also doing a large gray infrastructure program with large tanks and piping. But this is obviously much smaller on like a block to like property scale. And I think one of the most common practices they're using is right-of-way grain infrastructure. So right-of-way bioswales or like rain gardens. And they're going in all over the city. So I worked at Biohabitats now, but I used to work at New York City DEP, and I was started in 2013, and they had like a few hundred bioswales installed. And now they're up to like 9,000, maybe more than that. And so they are installing these right-of-way bioswales throughout the city. So this is just from Google Earth, just going in basically on sidewalks throughout the city and all those combined sewered areas, and identifying particular locations where these right-of-way bioswales can go. So like I was saying, the idea isn't that it's taking water out of the combined sewer system once it's in, it's preventing it from getting in there. So this is managing runoff from the road and from the sidewalk. The water is going down the gutter. There's kind of little curb cuts on the bioswale here. Water goes in, infiltrates into the ground, and doesn't end up making it to the combined sewer system.
Do you have any studies that can dictate to you how many of these things you need in order to have a measurable improvement in the water quality?
Yeah, so DEP, I'm trying to think if I don't work at DEP anymore, so I'm not speaking for them right now. But I would direct you to New York City DEP's most recent annual report, and I know they have a number of research projects where they are trying to look at that. It's going to depend on how bad your CSO is, also how effective are your bioswales, because a lot for these bioswales, it's very dependent on what the infiltration rate is of the subsoil, and a lot of the soil in New York isn't necessarily great, so you can't even put them in because they need to drain within a certain amount of time. So it's a little bit dependent on site specific, but I think generally, I think DEP did release a report that would give you that answer of like how many you might need to impact certain water quality. But then it's even deeper than that, because you have to then trace that down to the end of the pipe and what frequency of combined sewer overflows are you reducing. So kind of getting to that, and how does that impact water quality in, say, Jamaica Bay or in like Long Island Sound. But I would go on their website, and I can send you a link to their most recent report. They might highlight it in there, or at least give links to it.
I was thinking, like, I was going to say,
Mhm.
they're not disputable, they actually, this could help us save us that lawsuit.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and I know I also used to work at Save the Sound. fair disclosure to that too. I worked at Save the Sound for a year. But Save the Sound would be very on board with that. And I think, and it would just be citing them correctly. And I don't know if if DEC's stormwater manual does, but I know some do give like rough criteria of like how much water they manage per acre of bioswale or green infrastructure installed.
Yeah, what I'm thinking from your question is having the right engineering firm doing the right cost benefit analysis. And so whenever one hires an engineer or a consultant, it depends on how much they know, right? And it's because one can say, oh yeah, it's work in New York City, but guess what? It's a different set of parameters. And so my question to you, I mean, of course, Biohabitats.
I'm a consultant too. now I'm a consultant.
How would one, whether it's a private home, whether it's an apartment complex, or whether it's a city doing, what are the factors, or is there a checklist one can go to?
Yep.
And just start identifying the right consultants?
So I think the first step would be identifying the right consultant, would be advocating to the town on what you want to see from that project. And so I think the most relevant type of project for this type of work is a watershed management plan. And so I know Westchester County is doing a few of them. And that's usually where like municipalities and community members get involved with the watershed planning in the first place. And you might form like a watershed organization or alliance, exactly. And those organizations can then apply for grant funding and actually do projects. And oftentimes that's how a lot of these projects are kind of piloted, is through watershed organizations like alliances or associations. Like, you can have a blind book watershed association. So that's one way to kind of be proactive about it, of like form an organization that applies for grant funding and then does the project. And we get hired by those organizations all the time. The other way that in terms of identifying firms that maybe are thinking more about natural infrastructure is looking at projects that you think are good and seeing who the firm is that did it. And Westchester County is pretty good. They're doing a lot of natural infrastructure, and we've worked with them. They work with a couple other firms that also focus on natural infrastructure. But I think it's getting in at the early stage of watershed planning and then talking to the right folks. And now in terms of like an individual apartment complex or your individual home, there are also resources out there for you to be able to do things on your own, like little pilot projects. And so I can send a link to UConn has a really good like at-home rain garden guide or green infrastructure guide that I can send out. But yeah, it's a good question. I think it's like really about having the people who are making the decisions on board with focusing on nature-based infrastructure, which I think Westchester County is a pretty, from my experience, it seems to be pretty on board.
I was just going to mention that the town of Ryan, a lot of the permitting process, they actually have all the documents downloaded online. So if you went to the planning commission and looked at wetlands applications, you could click in and see what engineering firms did what for different proposed projects. So that's kind of where getting engineers.
Yeah, and it is certainly important too to have local knowledge, which oftentimes like Biohabitats, because we're pretty specialized in the ecological restoration world, we'll often be team with like a more local civil firm and provide advisory services on focusing on nature-based solutions or things like that.
Our mayor referenced the Army Corps as a group that would restore or somehow fix our dam situation. Where do they have to, talking about restoration, and I know they're engineers, they're doing well, but do they have the latest and greatest?
They do look at nature-based solutions. They also the Army Corps tends to do much larger projects too, right? So if there's again, thinking of an event like Ida and like the flooding that you might be experiencing here, it's like a large Army Corps project may be what's needed to actually resolve that for a large number of property owners. The Army Corps does nature-based solutions. They'll often, we have a few contracts with the Army Corps. So they'll hire firms like us to do planning and assessment or do design work. They also are regulators. So any work that's done within streams or within water bodies need approval from Army Corps permits. And so they need to review that. So they kind of factor in as both project implementation, they do design work themselves, and then they're also regulators.
Right, it's a jurisdictional thing.
Yeah.
So like, your field projects, I had actually spoken the day before the shut down. I don't know how I'm on court people to figure out DEC. If you, I don't know if everybody can do this, but you can ask them for evaluation. Who actually has jurisdiction on a particular parcel you're talking about, and they will very kindly say, okay, this is New York State regulated wetlands, or it isn't. Army Corps is involved here. For this reason, whatever, it's just local, whatever. So those things can be delineated and explained, and then you don't have to, run around trying to find it.
Yeah.
But I started at DEC, and there's you contact them there.
And another good resource, I should be UConn. And then another good resource is the DEC Environmental Resource Mapper. It's an online like GIS mapper that anyone can access that does give you some idea of like some of the ecological resources in your basically any parcel or property.
I mean, there's fixing the dam, and then there's preventative for future. I think that's what I'm picking up here. I mean, there's like fix the dam, stop flooding, but then what other?
But I think that one of our representatives said, oh, we need to ask Purchase College to reserve this large swath of their campus in order to like slow down the water that's that's just like, somebody thought of that, I don't know if that is like, was dreamed up by this private citizen or before. But it just seems like you hear about these projects and, like, I don't know how they all kind of fit together and if they're evaluated and how to go about moving them forward if they're the right plan.
Well, I think that's what, down in Yonkers, they were flooding, and I don't know if anyone's been down there 10 years ago versus now, but they daylighted the Sawmill River, and that had a great effect in flood mitigation. But the way they did that was a group of citizens got together and formed an alliance. So what I would say tonight, we could definitely follow up with an email to all of you and get that started, because there is opportunity to approach this at the larger scale, deal with the dam, deal with the larger watershed issues, and get involved with the policies that affect our larger watershed. But then there are also, and I love the way you talked about the asset, like any property owner, any apartment complex owns assets that can be mitigation tools and hold your water. That should be like on everybody's mind, like your mantra, hold your water. And I think that's where just getting landscapers and your neighbors to rethink what it means to have a lawn, where should a tree, should there be 2 trees on my property, or should I have a line of trees on my property? And those are things that you can do by changing what you do on your own property.
We also have a 124-acre golf course that we are responsible for, and currently is proposing taking down maximum altitude. I don't think a lot of residents are even aware that this plan is sort of bubbling, but they've been marked, they've been RFP'd by an arborist who claims that they're either coming up to maturity, maybe non-native. There's a lot of different reasons that and this is all for, like, in my personal opinion, and what we can decipher from how this has started, is basically a vanity project on a reroute of a few holes.
Right.
So and I say this all, just because I have an opportunity to raise awareness, but also just as we're talking about all of these little projects that nursery field and what's happening at the golf course, that all of these things, like, how do we all come together to start working on this on a larger, more holistic level?
I love the idea of the watershed alliance, where it's like, it's not just like, the cities, it's actually the residents of the cities.
And there is, I'm pretty sure there's funding sources to pull that organization together. Long Island Sound Futures Fund is a good one through NICWIF. DC, I think, has some too. And again, I was involved in a couple of those organizations in Connecticut. So it's certainly very achievable, and they can get picked up pretty quickly.
Tomorrow is the city council meeting. I think it's also worth noting that none of our representatives are even attending meetings like this that are taking place. Is there anyone who might want to make that comment? I will be tomorrow.
Well, if I may say, they had a budget meeting today.
Okay, good.
Sorry. I know a couple of moments.
Okay.
I can do that.
All right, so we're like, so we are recording it and we will send it to them tomorrow.
Okay, great.
Excellent. So they know what they know.
Just pivoting, we had a question come in online, pivoting back to kind of what works and how. There was a question, are biosolids effective at filtering runoff and reducing eutrophication at all? Are there other ideas for reducing nutrient load in suburban and urban and suburban areas?
Yeah, answer to the question is yes, but it depends. And so it depends on what your site context is. What kind of type of runoff are you managing? What's your infiltration rate? Is it the right topography for bioswales? It's very site specific, but yes, bioswales are very effective at treating runoff for nutrients, which then in turn helps with eutrophication. And then was the question about like, what are some alternatives to bioswales in terms of managing?
Are there other ideas? Yeah.
Other ideas? Yeah, there are. So the next case study that I was going to talk about in New Jersey is looking at regenerative stormwater conveyance and more like constructed wetland system. Bit of a larger system, but that's one alternative. And then happy to talk about others during the regular Q&A. Floating wetlands are ones that come to mind. I know in Maryland, out of our Chesapeake Bay bioregion, there's a lot of living shoreline work that looks at water quality improvement. So definitely other alternatives out there. But I guess real quick for just wrapping up New York City. So they have those bioswales as a large part of the program, and then also public properties like schools and parks. So this is a schoolyard in New York City, clearly all impervious asphalt. And so the city's taking a large initiative to go through and redo a lot of these schoolyards and these parks to incorporate green infrastructure elements. And so there's permeable pavement, permeable turf, infiltration pits. I think this project was done in partnership with Chester Public Land. Also want to be clear, Biohabitats did not do this project. This is from DEP, from their report. We have worked on the bioswales, but not this project. I just thought this was a good example of how you can transform, a very bleak asphalt play yard into something that's more aesthetically pleasing, but also infiltrating stormwater. Happy to talk about New York City in more detail. But an alternative to bioswales, and this is in Teaneck, New Jersey, pretty dense suburban area. This is a project we did. It's at Teaneck Creek Park in Bergen County. It's a 46-acre park, and our project area is about 26 acres. It's a natural park, so probably kind of I got here in the dark, but probably kind of similar to, there's like kind of informal trails. There's some interpretive signage, there's educational components, there's some like large art installations and sculptures throughout the property. But the Teaneck Creek Conservancy and Bergen County Department of Parks reached out to us, identifying a number of problems in this park. So there was a major erosion issues. They have two large stormwater outfalls that discharge into the park that were eroding gullies. So that's one of them up in the top right corner. That's resulting in poor water quality on the water bodies on the site. So they have a couple little ponds, and all that water is going directly to Teaneck Creek, which is just to the east of the park. This whole site was also really dominated by invasive species, mostly Phragmites. Are folks familiar with what Phragmites is? It's awful. So a lot of Phragmites on the site, not great wetland habitat. And so Bergen County Parks, Teaneck Creek Conservancy came to us and was like, hey, can we come up with a restoration plan for this park? With the idea really being that erosion and water quality were going to be driving this plan. I know this is probably hard for you guys to see. I'll zoom into the different sections of it. So we came up with this plan to look at restoring, really the main goal was restoring a natural hydrology across the site. So previously, so there's these two outfalls that were coming out. So these are I think they're 16-inch pipes or 12-inch pipes coming out and eroding these gullies. One here and then one over here. And the water was basically just shooting right across to the creek over there and creating, again, these deep channels. And like we talked about before, that was just leading to the water getting to the creek faster, getting it off the property. Whereas, if this was really a functioning wetland system, that water would be moving through this floodplain and infiltrating into the ground, being taken up by plants. And so we looked at where can we divert the water? How can we restore some more of that natural flow across the site? And so we looked at, this is the northern part of the site. Here's that one outfall. And then there's a very urban stream on that side too, right here. And we looked at what we call sand seepage wetlands. And so it's essentially a wetland restoration across the site, cleared out a whole bunch of the Phragmites. I'll show you a graphic of what a sand seepage wetland looks like in a moment. But the idea is that bringing this flow here and letting it kind of come through this microtopography and into this wetland system, it's infiltrating into the ground, it's being taken up by plants, it's being held in these pools and moving very slowly across the landscape rather than kind of just shooting through a channel and eventually making its way to Teaneck Creek. And then same thing with diverting some of the storm flows from this little creek over here, this little tributary, diverting storm flows over here. So it's being treated going through this wetland system. And then just to zoom in on kind of the bottom of that graphic, here's the other large outfall. This is like a lot of flow coming out of here. And this more clearly shows the regenerative stormwater conveyance systems. So we installed those on this outfall too. Regenerative stormwater conveyance system, which is a way of dealing with that erosion coming out of that pipe. And so I show a couple of photos of it, but it's essentially like mimicking a step pool system you might see in some tributaries. So it's got some rocks, it's got some vegetation, it's got some sand, and it's slowing that water down coming through a channel. So we're looking to really change how the water is flowing through the site and try and mimic again more of like a natural wetland floodplain system. This is a profile of the sand seepage wetland. Pretty simple design. It's kind of just like, think of it as a berm and some pools, like a pit and mound over a large landscape. And so you get water ponding behind the berm, and then water is infiltrating through it. So plants are taking it up. Again, trying to, as you said, like hold the water as long as possible, preventing it from getting to the stream, allowing the plants to take up nutrients and take up water. And here is the regenerative stormwater conveyance system, RSC is what we call it. Kind of a detail of that. It's a little tough to see with the light, but so this here is plan view. So you have this pipe coming in under existing conditions. There we go. Let's see. So let me quickly go back to just show you where. So we're installing this on the top right here. That was the pre-existing condition. And the idea is that you have, going to that for now, but you have a pipe coming in here. And what we do is we fill it in with some stone, some sand, and some vegetation, and then put in this bubbler system. So it's like a concrete inlet of sorts. And so the water actually is forced to come up here, overflow on this, and then it kind of pools into these pools here, and then kind of cascades down the step pool system. So it's trying to mimic like a kind of like a cascade, rock cascade system, step pool system in the environment. And so again, slowing the flow, and then it's all with like sand underneath. So the water that's ponding there can infiltrate, to the sides and down. I do have some photos of the one that's constructed.
So you didn't add that white structure.
On this project, we did not add this structure here, correct. It's basically cut off here, and there's a small little overflow that we put in, but under drain. But really, the water is coming up to the top and just cascading down through that system. And the idea of addressing that erosion. So this is an older project with the same idea. You can kind of see the stones and the vegetation and kind of that natural cascade system. Yeah, a couple of slides. I'll have some photos of the one that's completed at TNEC. But is that kind of clear how that functions and what the intent of that is? It can be expensive depending on the size. So the one here is really large. So the photos I'm going to show you are like as a very large system. Smaller ones are definitely. It all depends on the size. This is part of a larger project. We definitely have a cost per linear foot I can give you that, like we generally say. I don't have it on top of my head. It might also be a little bit different up here because these haven't really been installed. This is like the first one installed in New Jersey. And I don't think there have been many installed in New York, if any. So finding a contractor who's comfortable doing it. Yeah, but I would say that probably a smaller one's a good one to pilot, because you can definitely do a pilot one for pretty affordable price, especially if you don't have serious flows coming out of your system. Basically identifying any eroding gully is a good starting spot. But I will make a note to send you that. So quickly just going through construction of TNF, we started it last year, and it just wrapped up all like the grading and earthwork. Started with site clearing, so clearing out all the invasives, making way for the construction equipment. And then we started doing the site grading. So these are photos of the sand seepage wetlands, mid grading, rough grading. So you can see the pools that are forming, some of those. So these are like kind of more like pumic mounds in the middle of the pools, and then some larger berms that are kind of holding that water, allowing it to, or slowing it down as it moves through the site. And this is construction of the RSC. So this is that really big belly that I showed earlier. There was filling within that eroding belly in that channel. And then we put in like these large, again, because this system is had a lot of very fast moving water in it. This is probably one of the larger RSCs that we've installed, just in terms of size of the stone, which makes it more expensive, but also it makes it more robust. So filling it with cobble again, and then eventually that becomes vegetated. So that's it in construction. I do have some photos of it completed. This is it. Oh, I want to say like a couple of weeks ago, in September. So this is the sand seepage. These two are like sand seepage wetlands. It hasn't been planted yet. A lot of that's cattail coming up. But we also do have a lot of juncus and some of the native grasses that were put out in some of the seed. It'll be planted next spring. So they're doing active invasive species control right now to try and prepare it for the spring to put in the native plugs that we're going to plant. But you can see, I think you can kind of see this here, like the ponding of the water here. That water has been ponded. This is after a pretty dry period, so that water has kind of been sitting there and creating that wetland hydrology. You have this microtopography. We use a lot of wood in our design, so those are all root wads from old trees that were on the site or trees that were taken down, and kind of installing these habitat features throughout the sand seepage wetlands and throughout the site. And then that top right corner is actually that tributary that was on the north side where we're diverting some of the flow. We kind of created an RSC there where we created a little step pool system within that tributary. And so that's already coming in with a bunch of vegetation. And there was a egret hanging out there when I was at the site. Actually, those egrets are like all over the site. And even like during construction, they were out there like fishing in the pools. It was very cool to see. I saw like catch 2 fish. And then this is the RSC. Mostly, so this is essentially complete for the most part during a storm event, but you can see how the water is kind of, it's like the step pool system. This is a very large storm event, so there's a lot of flow. But then the idea is over a couple of years, that really becomes vegetated and you don't see the stones as much. I didn't include any photos from some of the ones that we've completed down in Baltimore, but like you really just see a bunch of vegetation. And so the soil stabilized. There's also like all this this cobble material. And so it's reducing the erosion, reducing the amount of sediment that's moving downstream, therefore reducing the amount of nutrients that are being brought to Teaneck Creek, and creating a nice asset as well for the community. So that is basically just wrapping up this project of planting in the spring, and then it'll be complete. But I think that's another alternative to bioswales. Obviously, very different scale and very different context. But we're happy to talk if there's more urban context questions. We can talk about that too. That was my case study. I have a couple of other ones that we can talk about if questions come up, but that's it. I can send you guys my email. That's my email, and then happy to have questions after Laura goes. Okay. Sorry. Yeah, sorry. Very bad that they hyperlinked that. It's KDAHMS@biohabitats.com.
Comments? You want all of it?
I could talk all night.
No, really.
Have you ever worked with a municipality on wall dam removal?
I have not personally, but yes, Biohabitats has, and we recently got a team member out of Connecticut, opened our Connecticut office, Laura Wildman. She's like a fish passage dam removal expert, and she does a lot of dam removal and has done a couple in Westchester County. We actually have one right now. It's in the west side of Westchester County, Sprout Brook. I think it's in like Cortland or something like that. But we're working on the design of that right now. So yes, that's not with the municipality, but we have before. Happy to put you in touch with her.
I have a question that came up when we were asking the sustainability committee about. So in a major storm event where it's not wind, it's not flooding, right? It's just rains, right? Is there a preferred or kind of a tree that does well? Like I have a red maple because I had a wet backyard and it was amazing, in reducing any kind of muddiness. But in something that's happening really fast, Is there, is that such a thing or no?
Like a species, I might defer to you, Laura.
Sure, yeah.
Yeah, Laura's gonna be,
What's that tree? What would be a great tree for those intermittent events?
Yeah, I mean, any of our like kind of like trees that we typically see in floodplains and in wetlands, particularly floodplain tree species because they're typically able to handle both wet and dry.
So when property is not that way.
Yeah.
So.
Right, exactly. So something like a red maple is really great because they are able to, they really, really wide tolerance in terms of soil moisture. To the question of like, is there going to be a tree that can like really rapidly pump water out of the ground out through its leaves, as trees do so magically?
Anyway,
Yeah. I think no, not quickly enough that it's going to make a huge immediate difference during a big rain event. Yeah, I think the looking at like you know, having trees better than not having trees, you know, having like just a lot of dense vegetation is going to help you for sure. Yeah.
and
versus lawn.
versus lawn. And
Versus
then
lawn.
and there's like a difference too, right, Laura, in like the like fast growth versus or slower growing species. And I don't know if that influences like how effective they might be in that environment.
Yeah, in terms of
Like I don't what's like a sycamore fast growing or catalpa too.
yeah, sycamores grow really fast. Sycamores are good floodplain tree species.
What was it? I'm sorry.
Sycamores?
Sycamores.
Yeah. So those are beautiful trees, good choice that grow well and grow fast. Along tulip trees as well, grow really fast and can handle, you know, wet conditions. So those are both really fast trees. There are things like willows, particularly some of our like shrub willows do really well in wet conditions. They're not going to be like a tall, beautiful, you know, full canopy tree. No, but they'll do a great job. Yeah.
Green roofs, residential, building work, investigating, you don't see them very often.
They're worth investigating from the stormwater management. The challenge might be if there's enough structural integrity to the building, because the roof may not, or the house may not have been built to withstand those loads. That's why you tend to find them on more like industrial buildings or commercial buildings, because they might have been designed to actually, they could have been added on to later. So they're built for like a anticipated load that isn't going to end up being there, but it's worth investigating for sure. And I think if you contacted any architect or like a structural engineer, they could let you know if it's feasible.
That are more trying to this kind of work, but I don't think there's no houses around here that have them, so I don't imagine.
They might be pitched a little too much too. I think so. Green roofs tend to work pretty well on flatter roofs. Yeah.
Is that an opportunity to borrow another one of these on?
Yeah.
I don't know, link.
So there's that. You put an impermeable barrier. Like the safer option is to take the gutter and bring it to a rain garden on your property. But if it's like if it's in a pretty tight, dense area, that might be the only solution. But I know residences in New York, at least one or two in Connecticut, that have done like very small green roofs. Yeah, so extensive green roofs. Oh yeah, sorry. Okay. There you go. Yeah, I was gonna say sometimes you see roofs that look like they're green roofs. They're probably really just decaying.
I'd like to thank you. I think the work you do is fantastic, and it's going to contribute to the long-term sort of environment. Really inspiring. One thing I've heard recently is the whole notion of a climate emergency. I know that's something you're hearing, but I've always wondered like what that actually means. Does that connect into your industry in a meaningful way?
Yeah, absolutely. In a number of ways. I think so. Oh man, there's so many ways to go with that question. One, it's thinking as an engineer, it's like, how are we thinking about storm, like recurrence intervals, right, for storms? Are we designing to a 500-year storm that is maybe not a 500-year storm anymore, because the way we calculate that probability doesn't really make sense. Or maybe it's just the record that we're looking at maybe doesn't make sense. So I think it's impacting us as engineers in that way of what we're designing to. It's impacting the way that we're thinking about some of these designs. So like I didn't talk about this because it's not necessarily related to watersheds as much, but like thinking about coastal flooding is a whole other issue. Well, it's all tied together, but it's also related here because Blind Brook is an estuary, right? It goes out to Long Island Sound. So you have like tidal flows that are impacting that. And you have the coastal flooding that's associated with sea level rise and storm surge. So in our work, climate change is, we're thinking about how can communities adapt to climate change through using natural systems or mimicking natural systems. And then preventing or climate mitigation, thinking about, doing vegetation in these systems, they're taking up carbon. And so it's a carbon sequestration strategy as well, which some of those, no more gray infrastructure doesn't really provide that benefit either. So it really impacts us in a lot of ways. I think we're trying to be as holistically minded about climate change in our work.
Question, I think, so definitely climate change, there's a specific designation of climate emergency. How many budgets are being like adjusted in order to,
Like a pool of emergency funding that's set aside for climate related emergencies.
I think there's like an awareness campaign going on more broadly about this notion of a climate emergency, helping to change the way we make decisions about the future.
Yeah.
So,
I think we see it and a lot of this room see it. I think the way that, I'm biased because like I get more, our company like does more work, right, related to this. And I think, so I am seeing it in that there's a lot of money going towards these initiatives. And I think people are waking up to it. And I think people are waking up also to using natural systems where you can't really engineer your design out of everything or engineer your way out of everything. So I think I'm seeing it that way, but I totally agree with you. I hope people are waking up more.
So it's not a question as much as a reminder for everyone here that if you're really interested in learning more about what the city is doing, I would highly encourage everybody to at least start to attend the city council meetings. They are doing a flood update at the head of every one of these meetings. So you'll find out the city has hired an engineering firm. They're looking at 14 sites separate from Blind Brook around the city that experienced flooding for the first time during this last storm that had damages. They're assessing that. By the end of the year, they're going to come up with a plan, supposedly, that's going to say, these are the problems, these are the solutions, this is how much it's going to cost. And then it's going to have to be, voted and put through a political process as to which one of those projects gets funded and to what extent. But they are down the road. They are working with the Army Corps of Engineers and have been in lockstep, at least as far as I know, talking about Blind Brook and storm mitigation. So, we have a lot of problems in this town. The legislative process we need to change some laws. We're allowing builders to run roughshod over the landscape, basically. They're allowed to cut down trees. There's a $25 fine for taking mature trees down. That's absurd. They're clear cutting blocks before they build. And when the city comes around, they say, oh, gee, yeah, okay, well, here's your $25 or here's 5,000. I'm going to walk away with $1 million. So, those laws need to change. I've been pretty involved with the Board of Review, the Board of Appeals here, where you see builders advocating for variances. It's a chance to publicly make your voice heard. In every one of these meetings, it's open for public discussion, and it takes advocacy to make change. It's not going to happen unless people stand up at every one of these meetings and say, we have a problem.
I stand up a lot, and I don't feel like and I also really feel like you're right, the builders run this town, and the city really relies on volunteers, regulatory bodies, way too much. And the way it runs is divide and conquer.
Yep.
And So one person gets, excited about one issue, and so they go to the Board of Architectural Review, or they go to dry sustainability, or they go to, city council. But then they get around you and they still manage to go forward.
Well, that's what Christine was talking about, coming together.
Right, so there's, a way to do this more, not just like going to the city hall, but at the larger scale where you are a collection of municipalities. And then your voice is kind of a little bit louder that way. And I think the benefit of that is not just the louder voices, but back to that first slide of the map of our watershed.
Right.
Yep.
It's true. It's awful to cut down trees at the Rock Golf Club. But if somebody's cutting down 5 acres above us,
Right.
that's worse. And it's not just the 5 acres, it's actually multiplied because it's happening everywhere. And I think to just kind of close up this conversation, because we could go on all night. My takeaway from listening to Kevin's brilliant presentation is that we want to elect Kevin as president of our workshop.
Oh, wow. I didn't know that was what was happening this evening.
We're giving you that authority right now, and you're going to task us with just 3 policy changes. Like, if we're going to leave this room, some of us are going to form an alliance. Everyone's going to look at you to do it. I'm going to say, I don't have time. What are the 3 policy issues we should really focus on?
I don't know if I can answer that question because I don't know what the policies are. I would say look at your zone, look at your zoning, probably, right? Like where are things being built? Again, I don't know enough about Rye for that. I think the most, and nothing about policy, I think if you were actually going to form a watershed alliance, and I've seen this in other communities, if you get a group together and you can apply for funding and do pilot projects, that will demonstrate to folks that biospheres work here, or this is how it can be done. Because I think pilot projects are really key to getting by.
By getting funding for that.
Yes, and apply for funding. There's a lot of money out there that goes to community groups. Even the Rye Nature Center is probably an eligible applicant. So I would say get pilot projects in the ground so that you can demonstrate that, organize, and then advocate. I'm trying to think of other policies. Sorry.
Are there any non-policy suggestions or recommendations?
I think again, just pilot projects and advocating for, if you going to, I think like General said in the back, getting involved and speaking with people and learning what's going on is probably the most important thing to do. Because the reason I can't really answer that is because I don't have a great pulse on Rye or Westchester County for that matter. So I think being informed is the best thing you can do, and then arming yourself with some of the information that I presented or what others are doing, and going to them and saying, hey, have you thought of this? Because they might not have, and then trying to put those new ideas out there. Yeah.
Thank you so much for tonight.
Thank you guys. This is very, very exciting. Thank you.